Nous formons la prochaine génération pour relever les défis stratégiques de demain. Nous sommes dédiés à comprendre pour mieux agir.
Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Re-bienvenue au colloque annuel du réseau d'analyse.
Welcome back to our annual colloquium. You may have missed our initial panel, or you may have missed Mike Rouleau. And if it's the case, fear not. All of the presentations will be available on the website. We will now be moving on to our second panel on capacity building and conflict management. After tremendous failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, capacity building within partners is very important. This is also amplified by the increased importance of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and reinforcing capacity in Eastern Europe. In order to better understand how to strengthen capacity, I'll be handing the floor over to Theo McLaughlin. Theo is Professor of International Relations at University of Montreal. Theo, over to you. Thank you very much, Justin. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel on capacity building and conflict management. I believe that it is something that we need to focus on given our current priorities. We have turned to experts in Canada and civilian conflicts, and today we'll be speaking to various aspects of conflict management, the role of the USNCR, amongst other things. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the members of this panel. Lee Seymour is my colleague, professor in political science at the University of Montreal, and he is also the chair of armed conflict in the University of Montreal. He currently conducts research that's funded by the Human Sciences Center. And we're also joined by Bruno Charbonneau, who is professor in international studies and the director of the Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean. He's also the founder and director of the Center Franco-Paix. His work is in armed conflict. Mostly he studies regional and international dynamics in conflict management in Africa. He will be speaking to the current response to conflict internationally. Finally, Yolande Bouka, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's. She's worked in various organizations, including USAID, the UK Department for International Development, the United Nations, the African Union, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she focuses her research on African politics and security. Her current research is a multi-sited historical and political analysis of female combatants in Southern Africa. And today she'll be focusing on women in Africa. Just like our first panel this morning, each of our panelists will have 12 minutes to make their presentation. And my role then will be to manage their time. So without further ado, I would ask Lee Seymour to make his presentation. Lee, thank you, Theo. Before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers of this invitation to speak to you. And I also want to underscore the role that Stephanie and Justin have played by organizing this network. Thank you very much for your efforts. So my presentation will focus on capacity building by military powers, more specifically, looking at the research we are currently conducting with Theo McLaughlin and the entire research team at Université de Montréal that includes many students as well. The project is on training abroad and security as well, more generally. There has been substantial growth in militarization over the past couple of decades abroad. It's mainly the case in the US, but as well other allies and rivals. And we are noticing that even in Canada, we conduct training and capacity building in Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordania, and even Ukraine. Our current research focuses on the political consequences of military training within the states where it's supported. That's the first part of my presentation. I think that a good proportion of our knowledge on military training is imprecise, if not incorrect. To this point, to summarize the current knowledge on the topic, the various research has tried to show that military training destabilizes relationships between civilian authorities and military authorities in host countries. It also produces national armies that are not very effective and do not respect human rights and also foster corruption. Therefore, military training has relatively negative impacts, whereas their goal is to create stable states. With Theo, we noticed that military training overall has less negative impacts than what is generally presented. And you may have heard, for instance, of the coup in Mali. There are arguments that link the coup to military training, and I'll come back to this a little bit later on. Actually, what we've observed is that military training overall has less absolute influence than what we generally believe. And I think that a good part of our erroneous perception of the consequences of military training has to do with the failures that we've seen, historic failures that it's hard to forget, the nation building failure in Iraq on a smaller scale, but still significant, Mali, Somalia, in more recent years. And of course, the Cold War, Vietnam, El Salvador, and so on and so forth. But these very broad missions are carried out in very intense violence, and therefore they hide or do not provide the significant focus on training that's conducted on a smaller scale within. So with Theo, we collected data on military training provided by the US over the course of the past few decades. And this data allows us to draw conclusions on the impact of this training in a more rigorous fashion. We looked more specifically at the military training and its relationship with potential coups. In the past, researchers tried to establish a link between military training, especially American military training, and the risk of a coup. However, what we have found is that there is no significant link between military training provided by the US and the risk of a coup in the host countries. So in order to summarize the situation quickly, I would say that our research is more optimistic. We have observed that military training can provide standards essentially that focus on professionalism and the appropriate control of civilian forces. And in fact, recent studies pointed to positive results between military training and human rights. So I think that a lot of the worries associated with military training are overblown. However, and this is something that will be the second part of my presentation, I believe that there are still central questions, important central questions regarding the strategic influence in the longer term of these activities that deserve more attention. Creating national armies will not, as such, create a more stable state. However, there are aspects of military training that can be problematic for host countries because sometimes the military training is defined as the default option rather than a more holistic approach where diplomacy becomes synonymous with military training. And more trainers have been tasked with creating stable states from the military up by transforming armed forces thanks to civilian institutions. So I think that the feasibility in the long run of this goal to transform host countries should be challenged. Now, I also think that there are opportunity costs in this strength and focused on solely on military action or military training. I'd like to conclude. I do have a few minutes left. I want to conclude on a few avenues with respect to what we understand of the conditions in which military training is more likely to be effective, not only to create more effective armies, but rather to increase stability overall. I believe that the intrusiveness in other states is important. Marla Karlin, I think, has demonstrated this quite convincingly. Military aid from the US has worked where the US got involved in delicate security issues within the host country. Secondly, and in the same vein, capacity building requires large-scale efforts and closer coordination between different stakeholders. For instance, look at Somalia, where you have a lot of international organizations, regional organizations that are involved in training activities, and there's no real coordination amongst them, which means that there are military factions that can work quite well, but there's no coherence, and that undermines discipline that you would normally see in a more coordinated approach. But I also believe that within the states, we need to strengthen defense institutions beyond military units and also integrate governance structures and civilian structures. Thirdly, and I'll finish on this, the international context, the climate is also important. Training carried out by NATO in Ukraine, for instance, cannot be looked at without understanding the role, subversive role of Russia in the area. In Africa, the role that China plays also has to be looked at very closely because China and the US are struggling to get the greater influence in the area, and that undermines security in the area. And I think that the liberal view that underscores this capacity building from the US and other allies, it contrasts with the Chinese model. We could even think of the Turkish model, there are more stakeholders getting involved in these activities, and sometimes their models are attractive for partner governments. To tie this back to the overall theme of this colloquium, these activities could eventually contribute to greater international fracture rather than stitching these powers together into greater order. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. Moving on then to Bruno Charbonneau. Thank you, Theo. Thank you to all of you. I'm very happy for being here. I'm very happy to be speaking to you and very happy to have the invitation. So I'll be coming back to the Security Council and looking at the past year and COVID-19. And I'll look at the role of the Security Council in overall stability. The impact that Guterres had in the ceasefire, in fact, I would invite you to look at a paper that will be published in the International Journal that I co-wrote. It's part of a forum that I organized on international order and the COVID-19. I'll be also looking at tensions within the Security Council in terms of international intervention or conflict management and resolution. And in conclusion, I will look at future avenues, perhaps some that tie back into Canada in order to feed our debate. Now, as you know, COVID-19 has revealed a lot of tension in the international order. As Secretary General Guterres said, he compares COVID-19 to an X-ray that has revealed broken bones, myths, and lies really about international cooperation. So looking back to March 23rd, 2020, Secretary General Guterres asked for an immediate ceasefire in order to put an end to armed conflict and to focus on the conflict of our lives, COVID-19. This was based on the idea that wars allow disease to spread by reducing local capacity to face disease. His idea was to support ceasefires in order to focus on COVID-19. This call for peace actually was a strong show of leadership on the part of Guterres. However, this initiative wasn't well supported by the Security Council. The Security Council did support Resolution 2531 3 months after the call for a ceasefire, but the practical impact on conflict zones was essentially null. Now, the effect of COVID-19 has been limited in some areas, but for the Security Council, it was a missed opportunity to put an end to conflict and to reinforce the position of the United Nations in the peace-building process. And despite that, COVID-19 has been and will be a long-term challenge, namely for the Security Council's desire to look at non-traditional threats such as the environment and pandemics. Now, there has been an impact on supply chains, on other aspects of social life, and therefore, in the year to come or years to come, the pandemic will certainly have an impact on current conflicts. And negotiations on resolution were difficult because of diverging views between Russia, the US, and China. Russia and the US are concerned about ceasefires and its impact on their operations in Iraq, Syria, amongst others. But a greater obstacle was the conflict between China and the US with respect to the reference to the WHO. This transformed in a war of words between the US and China. The Trump administration in this context clearly showed that it gave up its leadership role in the council, and to a degree that it looked at the UN system as a constraint for US imperialism. Therefore, it blamed China, blamed the WHO for the pandemic, and in July announced that it would be leaving the WHO in 2021 and blocked any multilateral response to at the G7, G20, and beyond. So the Security Council, in this respect, was a resounding failure for a resolution that should have been quite simple to implement without large impact, really more symbolic. So it really showed its weak leadership. Now, this isn't surprising for people like me that study the Security Council, given recent tensions. However, it is worrisome given the importance of the Council as the main entity within the UN that can improve or hinder cooperation on an international scale, and that may have an impact on the use of force. Now, it's the only entity of the UN that has the ability to take binding decisions, and especially under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, to turn to military power. So it is the most powerful group within the UN. Now, COVID-19 can be compared to a historic context. If you look at the future role of the Council or international interventions supported by the Council, you can think about peacekeeping missions, for instance. The first challenge is certainly tension between the P5, the members of the Council that have a veto. In most of the peacekeeping missions, especially in Africa, P5 are generally in disagreement, but within certain limits that still allow for cooperation. If China and Russia often feel differently from the P3 with respect to Mali, Central Africa, or elsewhere, these countries generally do not use their veto in these conflicts. Now, France and the US in the past few years have had quite deep differences of opinion with respect to Mali or Sahel, but they've always found a way to deal with these diverging views in a respectful manner. Now, at a strategic level, tensions within the P5 means that tools to bring about peace are weakened. There are plans that are pretty well thought out by the UN, for instance, in 2013 and 2015. They were not feasible given the tensions, and especially in 2017, 2018, given tensions between Russia and the US, it was impossible to lead such missions in Ukraine and, in fact, in Libya. So P5, outside of perhaps France, seems skeptical with respect to the role that peacekeeping missions could play in fighting against the jihad terrorism. However, the UN has undertaken historic action in Mali, and the members of the P5 generally turn to other tools in order to deal with Al-Qaeda and the Islamist State without the involvement of the UN. So the members of the P5 can always compromise, sometimes against their will, in response to what they would consider minor conflicts or conflicts of less importance. In other words, the conflicts in Africa. Now, I have 4 points to share in conclusion. The American point of view. I think the American point of view, it would be easy to conclude, would be very different with the election of President Biden. That with President Biden, we'll have a new approach. Now, that's certainly the case, I would imagine. However, we have to underscore two potential obstacles to transformative change. Firstly, tensions between the US and China will not disappear overnight, especially not on the economic front. President Biden has said that he would be reopening some talks in order to secure American interests, economic interests. And secondly, if we're hoping to restore American leadership on an international scale, this leadership will certainly be slowed down by a couple of things. Firstly, President Biden will have a lot to deal with internally, domestic policy, if only to manage the COVID pandemic, but also because I think the rest of the world will also understand that Trump 2.0 is possible. Trump could be reelected in 2024. So American promises will always come with this looming potential. We'll never know if Trump could be reelected, especially because the Biden administration will not control both houses. Now, with respect to Canada, in my opinion, COVID-19 has disrupted many priorities. This will not come as a surprise to you. You probably know that we are hoping for a return of Canada on the international scale. In my world, we talked about a return of Canada in peacekeeping missions, within UN missions. But if that's the case, we'll need to undertake missions in Africa. And I would quote David Black from Dalhousie that wrote in 2015, when we looked at the Canada-Africa relationship, we have to remember that the only thing we can say about the policy is that it's quite incoherent. So there's a lot of work to do. Now, given what I said about the Security Council and Canada, I think we'll have to look at various options if we want to intervene, or at least have a role to play in conflict resolution abroad. These other options mean looking at regional and sub-regional organizations we could partner with. Now, which ones? That's a really thorny issue. I don't have the answer to that, but we can certainly talk about it, especially given the disruptions that are created by the American election and COVID-19. And finally, Theo, I'll be handing the floor over to you in a minute, but I did want to suggest one thing to my colleagues. Together, we tend to talk about large powers, for instance, the rivalry between China and US. But I think we also have to look at the ways in which we look at problems, given that issues are becoming transnational. This is something that COVID-19 has exposed. And it's also the case with climate change. And there's one thing we don't talk about much. I'm talking about financial markets. COVID-19 has had an impact on financial markets, and this in turn has an impact on international relationships. So one day or another, we'll have to stop looking at the larger powers and look at the larger challenges that COVID-19, pandemics, and climate change can pose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's greatly appreciated. I'm extremely pleased to now present our next speaker, our Professor Yolanda Buka. You now have the floor. Good afternoon. I am trying to roll my slides. Can everybody see them? Yes, it is working. Thank you. Before I begin, just like the other presenters, I'd like to say hello to my fellow panelists. I also like to thank all of the team at the Network for Strategic Analysis for all of this organization work, and I would like to thank them for their creativity. Thanks to this, we're able to all take part in this colloquium. I hope that next year we'll be able to meet in person. I was really eager to meet with some of the colleagues who are also on this panel. So the topic of my speech is to give you a bit of context of that is women, peace, and security in Africa. That is the top. And there was a meeting of the African Union in early 2020. The Canadian delegation went to Africa to focus on a partnership between Africa and Canada, specifically with respect to promoting and developing the African Union's efforts for peace and security and gender equality. This was an initiative that was a part of the push to obtain a seat on the Security Council, but it was also a call for us, as Bruno mentioned a few minutes ago, to question the absence or presence of relations between Canada and Africa. When we speak about gender and security and women and insecurity, there are a number of topics that we could dwell on today. Some of these issues include, among others, what is the place of gender in reforming the security sector, or what is the role of women in reforming defense or in justice reforms. As well, we could speak about the involvement of women in African peace missions. Most UN missions, as we know, take place in Africa right now, and among other things, there are some in the Central African Republic, as well as in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There is the UNISON, that is the African Union mission in Somalia. We could also address the impact of political and security crisis on women's security, both as regards their person as well as food security or economic security. We could also address the issue of sexual violence in a conflict zone, either committed by UN troops, because there have been several cases of such violence in African missions, or by armed troops, or the role that women play in the armed forces and in violence that is currently taking place either in Somalia or in the Sahel. But what I would rather do at this point is to take a step back and discuss the greater political context in which the African states are trying to address the issue of gender, insecurity, and peace. To begin, so what is this Women, Peace, and Security agenda? Here's a very quick overview of an agenda which I believe some of you no doubt have already seen. First of all, this agenda started with the United Nations, that is Resolution 1820, that was voted in 20 years ago. And this resolution, 1820, was the first instrument devoted exclusively to women in a situation of armed conflict. The idea was to acknowledge how gender, that is how women face conflict in conflict areas. There children are subjected to violence. And I've indicated 4 main pillars. So in addition to 1325, you also have all of the other resolutions here, which address the issue of prevention, protection, participation, as well as rescue and restoration. Prevention involves taking into account a viewpoint, which accounts for preventing violence against men, women, and especially young girls and women in armed conflict. Participation means encouraging women's involvement or participation in all levels of peace and security as part of the peace process, and in police forces and in civil society. Protection, of course, consists in promoting the security of the population that is at risk in a conflict zone, and assisting, that is reestablishing, means that one must promote the women's equal access to not only humanitarian assistance, but also with respect to disarmament and reintegration. So how will this agenda be implemented, or how was it implemented? The notion was to develop national action plans. And a national action plan is the institutionalization of the agenda by member states. So how do you turn an agenda which has seen several versions into legislation and programs in each country? Worldwide, 86 countries, that is 45%, do have a national action plan in place. Canada has its second action plan currently. So that is the overall agenda. But how do you enforce such an agenda? By accounting for the security context in Africa. And here's a very brief overview of the complicated security issue that currently exists on the African continent. Obviously, there is electoral violence, which every year or every 2-3 years, depending on the region, undermines the election process in Western Africa, in Central Africa, and in Eastern Africa. There is also post-electoral violence that occurred, for example, in Kenya 2007. There is extremism violence, which has increased substantially, especially in the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. And in Eastern Africa, this was also the case, but what we're also seeing this now occurring in Mozambique. So I'll let you read through the list, but very quickly, because I see that time is flying by very fast, I would like to speak to a context which is not necessarily in and of itself a security problem, but which has been underway for some 10 years, where we're seeing a drop in armed conflict overall in Africa. Nevertheless, there is a fairly significant increase in the protest movements that might turn into a rebellion. That was the case in Burundi in 2015. This was a very short-lived rebellion. Nevertheless, it shows that people are mobilizing in a situation where the government does not meet with their expectations. Here is a very quick overview of the Islamic militant activity in Africa. And here I would like to stress Western Africa, such as Ghana, Togo, and Benin, where previously there were no fears regarding these movements, but which is really testing their security capacities. Now, regarding displacement of populations due to instability, currently, at least last year, there were more than 7.3 million persons in Africa who were displaced due to armed conflict. So that is the general security context. But who are the bodies or institutions that are at stake with respect to peace and security in Africa? There's the African Union. And I'd like to spend a moment, if I may, to explain the complexity of the structure of Peace and Security Council. There's the African Union, which has the Peace and Security Council at its core, but around this Peace and Security Council, which has neither the same mandate or the same power as the Security Council at the United Nations, but this works alongside a number of different bodies in order to take steps to ensure peace and to manage conflicts. And yet, the African Union works with economic communities on the basis of the principle of subsidiarity. That is, even though the African Union technically manages the security situation in Africa, it often hands over the responsibility of management and negotiation to the economic regional communities. And there are approximately 8 of these. The problem, however, is that these regional economic communities are not all the same. For example, we have the CDAO, which at the time of previously was responsible for deploying troops in Western Africa. On the eastern side, you also have the Eastern Africa community, which focuses mainly on economic integration and not necessarily as to conflict management between the key stakeholders in the country. So I believe that this is important to take into account when it comes to implementing the women, peace and security efforts in Africa. There's a great diversity with respect to the enforcement of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. First of all, this is a 3-tier implementation on the African Union level as well regionally and statewide. Within the states, we need to understand that the communities themselves sometimes have to take charge of their own initiatives for security. So I really like this table because this very clearly shows that among all of the regions that I've just mentioned, it is the ECOWAS that is taking responsibility for these efforts. They developed their own national action plan. Only 25 states out of the 55 countries in Africa have such an action plan in place. Regarding the African Union, there are a number of documents and protocols that try to frame the promotion of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. There's a new special envoy office. There are a number of documents that govern the structure of peace and security. And yet, how this agenda is implemented on the ground gives rise to a number of questions. There are not necessarily any tools to assess the efficiency of all of these documents and protocols. The African Union, and I'll be done in just a minute, the African Union has asked all of the economic communities to develop their own action plan for the region. However, the issue is that some of the regions are less active than others, have fewer resources available to develop these action plans. And some of the regions, in addition to their regional action plans, also have other political framework available to promote the same issues, and these compete with the development of the action plans for implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And those who have followed the situation in the region closely, there can be a country that may be a member of several regional communities at the same time. As a result, this could give rise to conflicts of interest between certain plans or domestic policies and regional policies. And finally, very quickly, let me give you an example of a country that provides troops for the UN and the National African Union. Kenya developed 2 action plans, one in 2016 and one in 2020. It has a constitutional provision in place that stipulates that no more than 2/3 of certain gender groups can control any institution of the state. At the minimum, you need 1/3 of the parliamentary seats, and in the president's cabinet has to be occupied by women. But despite this constitutional provision, the government is unable to agree with, is unable to implement its own constitution. So here are a few statistics as to the number of women who are in the armed forces, in parliament. And Kenya, despite the role that it plays internationally to put in place peace and security, continues to see many issues to apply gender equality as well as sexual discrimination and violence against women. In closing, why is this important, especially in the context of Canada? It's important to understand that if Canada truly intends to become a major partner on the African continent and where it wants to establish, build peace and to ensure gender equality, it's important to understand the various levels of action where it will have to intervene. And especially the European partners in Northern America tend to want to partner with the African Union, despite the fact that the African Union has many protocols and documents in place that promote gender equality. It is really up to the regions and the states to develop these instruments that are not quite sound at this time in various regions of the continent. And finally, given the issue of the legitimacy of the African Union in the states when it comes to their own community, one has to imagine how difficult it will be to implement this agenda locally where women actually mobilize to protect their own rights. Thank you very much.